Why don't you outline for us what your question is?
Okay, so
And
we're going now.
yeah, we'll kick it off if you're ready.
I am ready.
All right, great.
So last time we did one of these, the people in the YouTube comments complained that I took too long to ask the question.
So take even longer this time.
That's exactly what I was about to say. So
Okay.
I'm going to make sure that even though I think I could ask this question much more succinctly than the other one, because it's a much more straightforward question, I'm literally going to take absolutely no pains to do so. So, set the stage. The reason I happened to start thinking about this recently as something to talk to you about was because I saw, I don't remember who posted it, might have been Orshi, or it might have been someone else from Thekla, posted a picture of the Sokoban game, and there were some plants. Like, I think it was Orshi, I think she had been working on plants or something. And so there was a picture of the Sokoban game with a bunch of the tiles were filled with different plants, like a brush or under, I don't know what you want to call it, but foliage, right? And it's pretty clear to me from looking at it, I was like, these are not each probably gameplay unique, meaning you could look at them and go, well, it's probably not the case that each of these individual plants is a specific entity type that means something gameplay-wise. Like, a bunch of them are probably just mean that you can't move in this square or something, right? And it reminded me that I was like, there's this whole thing, and you did it originally with Braid as well, where you had to work pretty hard to make sure that you could always differentiate the foreground from the background. There's this whole lineage of thinking where it's like, how do we make sure that when the player looks at the screen, they're getting both like a pleasant audio-visual experience that like helps them want to be in the game and helps communicate the aesthetics of the game, but that also can clearly communicate to them what is and is not an important difference. Because any difference in the art, even just differences in aesthetics, are differences that the player can perceive. And you need the player to know things like, this is just an aesthetic difference, whereas this is a meaningful difference in gameplay. Like, you can or cannot stand on this is a different kind of thing than just, this platform looks slightly different from this other platform for aesthetic reasons. And so I was thinking, to now wrap it up, because I think I've taken enough time now to piss off the people in the YouTube comments. If I haven't, I apologize to all the people who wanted me to, and that includes me.
Yeah.
So the question is just, for the Sokoban game, I feel like this is the perfect example of a game that if you were just going to make it in like ASCII art or something, then the meaning would always be completely clear to the player, because every individual thing on the screen would just have its meaning, would be its representation. But and the same was probably true for the originals that you sort of were using as a basis for making this game, because they were very simplistic art styles, most of them. So in making the Sokoban game, I felt like this was the perfect environment to ask and for you to talk about, how do you think about bringing all of this additional aesthetic quality into this game when you still have so much cognitive work to do to make sure that the player always understands, this is a place they can walk, this is not a place they can walk, this is a water tile which means certain things, this is where a lily pad can go, this is a crystal that affects blah, and this is not, you know, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So that is the whole question, and there you
yes. go. Okay, well, I think that was actually shorter than last time.
All right.
I don't know. I didn't time it.
Okay, all right.
A couple opening remarks. My first thoughts are, A, this is something that almost all modern games get wrong, actually. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to look at games for examples of how to do it well. I probably, if I were being good, I could probably think of some. But generally what happens is the better production values get on a game, the more people make the mistake of not being clear enough in this dimension that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
That dimension being the difference between what's an aesthetic difference and what's a functional difference, right?
Yep.
Okay. B, my best answer for this is going to have to be general because it is situational in ways that I'll try to explain how I think about it. But
Yes.
like my decision making for this goes differently on every game based on how the game works and all this stuff, right?
Yes.
And then thirdly, I guess, is the caveat that I normally would give, not to get too postmodern sounding about it, because taking this kind of statement too far makes somebody a total dweeb. But it is nevertheless the case that we're going to talk about these categories as being completely different, and they're not really, right?
Right.
So even a nominally like aesthetic difference is still a functional difference, right?
Yes.
Most obviously, like what color you make something or how high contrast or how low contrast, even if it doesn't have an ostensible game mechanical effect, will affect how clearly you can see it against the background, how much it bothers your brain that, you know, maybe I'm seeing everything I need to see about this and maybe I'm not. It'll affect your reaction time, you know, if it's an action game and all these things. So, but we are factoring that out for the purposes of this conversation. And we're really talking about things where you could write down on paper a rule difference in the rules of the game based on the two objects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Based on the variance of the object.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, okay, so my first answer about the Sokoban game. Sokoban game is an interesting case because we're not done with it yet, right?
Right.
And often how the art process goes, the art direction goes for that game, is we sort of have two levels of art direction where Orshi is keeping things together at the art team level. And then she shows stuff to me and then I kind of bump it a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it could, we actually looked at these a few weeks ago and I think I was fine with them. But the extra caveat being, what we ship may be very different from what you saw and so forth based on how things feel.
Right, right, yes.
But so with this game, I'll just start saying stuff and
yes,
we can take it wherever it's going to go, right? So just as with the general game mechanics, when somebody starts playing a game, part of what they're doing is they're figuring out what game they're playing, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're like, how does this game actually work? What am I supposed to be doing? What am I supposed to be responding to? What's important? What's not important? That includes the visuals. People, they may not realize it, but they're figuring out how to interpret the visuals when they start to play a game, right?
Yes.
And so part of what you're doing early on is you're establishing how you answered this question that you're asking, right? Now, sometimes it's not that obvious early on, right? But like sometimes it takes a long time for people to see the gameplay rules, right? That the visuals are tied to. So it may take a while for that understanding to develop, but nevertheless, it's like, if we jump one level meta from this, right? Let's say you decided how you were going to approach this as a designer, right? Or as an art director with one hat on and designer with another hat on. But let's say you do a bad job at following your own rule and it's inconsistent, right?
Yeah.
That's bad because the player's not really able to learn how this game works because it doesn't work a certain way, right?
Right. So
I think consistency is one of the most important things wherever you draw the line on this. Now, let me see. So I'm just going to start. I'm not necessarily going to approach talking about this in a very ordered way, but one of the very primary things that helps answer this question is this kind of chunking mechanism that the brain has, right? So when we talk about something specific like these plants, so for people who don't know the game, it's a grid-based game. The plants occupy one grid square. So they're pretty clear in a certain way. Like it's unambiguous to the player that the player is looking at, some kind of a map, and there's plants in various positions, and here's where they are. And the question is sort of just like, I don't know, what do I have to think about any detail about what these plants mean, right? You can imagine other kinds of ambiguity, like maybe the plants run together and you can't tell where one stops and another starts or something, but that's not the case for this game.
Well, and if I may, like, there's also the case where, again, because it's obligatory in all of these discussions for us to bring up certain secret games that no one can know about.
Yes.
There may be cases where something isn't necessarily something the player is thinking about, but that they've seen before, and suddenly they get an ability or something that now allows them to use that thing. So it's not even necessarily the case that the player can even know what those things are at the beginning, right? Because it comes out over time.
And that can be a really nice surprise, actually, right? Okay, so that reminds me of something I'm going to say later, but I'm going to wait till later on that one. So, so with regard to chunking, right? So in addition to the consistency being important, right? There's another meta thing, which is, okay, so the person's trying to understand your game, right? They sit down, they're like, what am I playing? It's what is very important and is often disregarded is how do they feel about how that's going? Do they feel that they're being successful in understanding your game? Or is it just kind of confusing, right? And again, this is not something that most people are gonna be very conscious of, but it is very major in whether a game feels, quote, fun or not, right?
Okay.
Because like if you're not getting traction in understanding the game and you don't even know that that's what's happening, you're just going to be maybe kind of confused, right?
I see.
Okay, so let me get back to the chunking thing that I still haven't gotten to the point of. With regard to plants like this, right? There's not a decision to be made on its own. Because for the game as a whole, so you've got plants, they're occupying grid squares. Those are, in this game, they're acting as barriers inside a walkable terrain that's grid aligned, right? And there are various choices made on that terrain, like how much coloration is there, both from square to square or within a square? Like how much do we break up the grid pattern with decoration? How, if it's on an island, which there are a bunch of islands in this game, how closely do the contours of the island align with grid squares, right? We're turning some dial between clarity of gameplay information and, nice lookingness, right? And we can dial that up and down, or natural lookingness, let's say, because nice is pretty subjective. We can dial that up and down, and for most things like that, there's actually a pretty good range. There's a pretty broad sweet spot where you have a good amount of agency that's all still in a relatively comfortable zone. So maybe you've got an island and maybe it's got contours. Maybe it's one of the maps that's more like, it's not an island. Instead, we form the outer wall of the level with some background like walls of a castle or something, right? Those walls of the castle, again, have a great deal of decoration on them that are not gameplay relevant. And so when the player is looking at these plants and asking, is that a gameplay relevant difference between these 5 plants that I see before me or not, right? That question is being asked inside the context of them already having experienced other ranges of visual difference. For example, in the introductory maps before they encounter these entities, for example, in the backgrounds, right, versus foregrounds and all that, right? And so already before the game, I mean, unless we're talking about the very first screen, already before this, a certain amount of interactivity has been established, a certain language of how things are visually represented has been established that people necessarily pick up on, right? They're not usually thinking about this exactly, but because they're playing the game successfully and getting better at it, they have picked up on this language and are learning it, right? And so the part of the problem with the question is, this is actually a general thing in art direction, even going down to style and stuff, is like non-gameplay relevant style at all. So like I'm thinking back to The Witness, for example, where we sort of, figured out, or, by like 2012, 2013, we had decided that we'd finalized the art style. We had done a bunch of scenes, right? And they all worked. And then we went to do like different kinds of foliage than we had done. And we were like, oh, wait, our art style rules don't really apply to this foliage. Or like we need to make new decisions in the context of this new thing that we hadn't thought of. And so our art style wasn't actually figured out yet, right? It took a while of building all these scenes in the game until we ran out of new decisions to make of the form, how do we make a decision here that is consistent with our existing style and accomplishes what we want to accomplish and looks good, right? And so that happens with this kind of a thing too. It's like you could start making this decision for backgrounds. You could start making it for, monsters or something, things that are obviously very active, and then start carrying that decision over. So when it comes to like a relatively compact sub object like this, on the one hand, the decision is a little bit independent of the prior ones. And on the other hand, we want it to be consistent with them in order to provide this feeling of consistency that helps the game feel good. But then also, of course, we want it to be functional in the way that you're asking. Like, we don't want to mislead. But actually, the misleading is only one out of about 3 or 4 major concerns with how this decision is made. Right.
Okay.
It is the most objectively measurable one in the sense that like you could talk to a player after they played and they could tell you that they were confused at first.
Right. Or you can see them obviously doing things in the playtest that indicate that they didn't understand the difference or something.
Yes. Whereas questions of like how consistent was your art style or how good did they feel about how they were learning the visual language, those are almost undeterminable,
right?
Actually, but I am thinking about all those things probably in roughly equal proportion when I do this kind of stuff. So that was a bunch of general statements that didn't answer your question at all.
Actually, so they did answer my question in one sense, which is, usually when I ask a question like this, I'm interested in hearing, because obviously I can imagine answers to the question, but I'm interested in hearing if there's any kind of answer, like parts of the answer that I hadn't really thought about correctly, like and I think in the last time we talked like this, it was similar. Like there was a very specific thing that I noticed, and I think we said it at the time, right? That I was like, I kind of see like much more clearly what, kind of how this thinking goes. And I think that already is sort of starting to happen here in the sense that what it sounds like is the question is sort of ill-posed almost because the answer is more just that you don't treat this as a separate thing, you treat it as the same thing. So when the player is learning, when the player sits down and starts engaging with the game, then just like you have to consider about how you're going to structure all of their initial experiences to make sure they understand how to play the game, you also need to structure all of those experiences to make sure that they have each opportunity to make the visual distinctions they need to make. So in a sense, I hadn't quite been thinking about that at all when I initially posed the question, but like that's a pretty important part that was sort of left out. It's like, look, it's not like you just make a bunch of art direction decisions and then the art does the job by itself. It's you also have to think about how did you design all of your initial experiences in the game to make sure that important art distinctions were encountered in ways that would allow them to differentiate themselves, just like gameplay rules. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I think that totally makes sense.
Okay.
I have a couple more things I could say about this that may feed into this. These are more like trying to give a general answer at a smaller level of detail than I just did, right? So if I were to indicate a gameplay difference with visual design, right, there's certain kinds of things that are better and certain kinds of things that are worse, right? So in the same way that I think we talked about before, like gameplay rules that are discrete often feel a lot better than gameplay rules that are continuous. Like if something succeeds or fails based on some invisible point continuously along some curve, that doesn't necessarily feel very clean, right? Whereas like, you know, things that have to feel very clean, like fighting games running very fast and stuff, they're often very discrete operations that happen, right?
Right.
So similarly with visuals, like if I'm going to make a plant and then another plant with the same mesh that's 10% more orange, that's not really a good way to indicate a gameplay difference, right?
Yeah.
It sounds obvious, but I thought I would just point it out, right? Whereas if you have like a cactus and then another cactus that's very flowery and with like cactus steam coming off it or something, right?
Yeah.
Actually, no, that's three. Let's just say a cactus and another cactus that's very flowery. That may or may not be a gameplay difference. And you sort of would learn by interacting with that whether that matters. And or whether that has been observed in similar things. We'll get to that in a minute, right? But like if you have most plants are staying still and then you have one cactus with flowers with steam coming off the cactus and it's shaking, right?
Yeah.
That had better be a gameplay difference because it's very active and grabbing a lot of attention and it's moving when other things aren't moving and it's got like a particle effect when other things don't, right?
Yep.
So you could very easily pose for yourself, like if you ever wanted to answer this question for a particular thing in a particular game, you could make a ramp like that of more and more obvious things or things that differ in some discontinuous way, right? Like moving versus non-moving is, I mean, I guess you could have another one, if we're not talking a cactus, but some kind of plant. You could have a plant slowly swaying in a breeze versus a plant like writhing around.
Yes.
Like some kind of alien jungle plant. Those are two different things, right? Mentally.
Right.
And so you've crossed some boundary. And it's important, I think, to notice that. And in fact, yeah. So the other thing I was going to say is once you start establishing this is another way to say the consistency thing I already said. There's some parallelism that needs to happen between different tracks of things, right? So if you have like, let's say you have monsters and you have some kind of difference on the monsters, right? And then you have some kind of difference on plants. Right. And plants don't move or attack you. Let's say plants are passive and give benefits if you're standing around them or something.
Okay.
If they're magical, I don't know. Right.
Yeah.
But you've got these two different categories of things. If your line of differentiation for the plants is, well, one of them is moving and whipping around and has particle effects and the other one doesn't, then probably the line of differentiation for like one monster versus another that has that's a very souped up version of the first monster should be about the same level of stuff, right? It should be moving more. It should have some particle effects or something. Like if you have a much subtler difference on the monsters than on the plants, that's going to feel weird and inconsistent. And you're going to be, I don't know, like it feels worse to play. Right.
Okay.
And it feels like the designer was not very careful, which again, people notice even though they don't realize that they notice.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. That's my initial thoughts on this. The other thing to say actually, so related to the consistency being important and the people feeling good about, there's just a lot of dimensions to this, right? There's how fun or how good the game feels to play in the beginning is related to how unconfused people are and how good they feel about how well they're learning the language of the game. But then that also, when we talk about gameplay and like what are we trying to give the player through gameplay, one of the things you can give them positively, right? Not just trying to prevent them from having a bad experience or trying to prevent them from failing to understand the game, but one thing you can give them in a strictly positive fashion is the feeling of being able to see and understand this particular visual language that this game has, right? It's like that's a skill that you develop as a player playing the game that you are able to understand and appreciate after you're done playing the game, just like you would be able to understand and appreciate, that you got better about, thinking about where to place your smoke machines in Advanced Wars 9 or whatever, right?
Okay.
It's similar. It's a little bit more subtle, but it's actually a similar thing. And so this can actually be approached in a very like a positivist design sense.
So I have other questions.
Sure.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add on those?
No, somebody just asked about, do I have a recommended laptop in the chat? And I'm not going to go off on that.
Okay. So taking this one step further, and this is now sort of a little bit outside of the bounds of the part that I was most interested in, which is the part that you already answered.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, since we have the time to do so, if you might want to talk a little bit about a related question, which is that, so in the best possible case, and one might argue that, like, I would totally accept an answer of, well, just don't ever do this, and games are stupid for doing this or something, and that's fine. But in the best possible case, when you're designing a game, you design the aesthetics of the game to go with the gameplay very closely so that you don't end up in situations where you leave yourself with incredibly hard aesthetic problems. And to make this a more concrete question, I'll use the example to start with of The Witness. So in The Witness, one of the things that would happen if it was a normal, like a Myst-like game, is that the player has no idea what they can and cannot use in the world, right? And The Witness solves this problem by saying, look, we're going to take a very strong stance on the game design that, like, literally we tell you exactly the only thing that you can interact with in this world at all is like a circle that you click down on to start tracing, right?
Yep.
And that's an example of coming from the design side and going, we're going to make this crystal clear to the player, even in a very complex game with a very complex environment. And then from then on, we pretty much just don't have a problem. Like, yes, there's a ton of work to do all the rest of the things that design demanded out of the art direction. But as far as that one particular thing goes, it's like the design solved the problem, right?
Kind of.
Kind of. Okay,
until
I'll let you talk first, and then I'll answer the question. Then.
Well, until you've tried it, you will see. If I say what I'm going to say, it's a spoiler for certain things. It's just that after making that decision, there's a certain amount of work that you have to do in the visual design of the world in order to not mess up that decision, right?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
But you don't have the game design ambiguity problem.
That's what I'm saying. Like, so I'm not
as long as you're good. As long as you're good at avoiding. I mean, you have to. The thing I guess I'm saying is you have to consistently avoid the problem throughout development by not introducing red herrings, but you at least have a clear way to avoid. It's like unambiguous how you can continue to avoid the problem.
Yes. The solution will always be the same, which is don't introduce something else. It may just be always difficult to quite find how to do that, but you know what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you contrast this with basically any game ever made that's like Myst, right? There's a problem that you have when you try to make a world that's a little bit more like I don't know what the right word for it is. Maybe like skeuomorphic. I mean, I don't know what the correct term is, but when you want the player to be going through a world and interacting with different types of things, so they can't all be necessarily exactly the same. What you typically see in these games is they have to effectively overlay a game HUD, for lack of a better term, to tell the player what the heck is going on. So they might like flash the objects that you can interact with, or they'll try to like paint those objects very clearly and like de-emphasize other objects, something like that. And so I just wanted to ask the sort of the follow-up question for that kind of design. Do you have anything in general to say about that kind of interplay? Is it just the case that, like, look, the game designer needs to do their job and make sure that the game design itself doesn't have that core problem? Or is it no, it can be attacked more at the aesthetic level? Or is it an interplay between the two? Like, do you have any thoughts on that beyond just don't do it?
I mean, I think it could be solved in other ways for sure. The thing that I was trying to avoid by doing these kind of decisions on the witness was, so there were two things simultaneously, right, that are related. And we could use a 2D point and click adventure, right, because it's right there in the name. One is when you spam click all over the screen because you're stuck on a puzzle and you don't know what to do.
Yep.
And you're just like, maybe something will happen if I click here. No,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And the other one is when you try to drag every item in your inventory onto every other item in your inventory to make things happen because you're stuck in the game, which happens with 100% of those games, right?
Yes.
So like part of it was really just like, look, how do I make a puzzle game where you're actually really doing the puzzles and not like flailing like that, right?
Yeah.
So there are probably other ways of doing it. So being very just clarity about things that are not what you're supposed to be stuck on is, it seems to me, the important part. And there are probably a lot of ways to do that.
Okay.
You know? Like you could imagine just having a 3D, like another way. This is related to what you just said, but I'm going to just make a pictorial example. Let's say you have some game where you're in a world and like it's all very detailed objects and stuff, but it's rendered sort of mostly in black and white or sepia tone or something. And so the colors are all muted. But anytime something is interactive, it's in like full color. And in fact, it's blooming a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So there's like absolutely no ambiguity that you're supposed to interact with this thing.
Right.
Nobody ever does that because I could say some things about game designers right now, but generally speaking, game designers are not willing to make hardline, untraditional choices like that in order to make things work. So like the witness thing, the way the witness works is extremely unusual, right? Like people just don't, especially in a 3D world, people don't do that. Usually.
Yeah.
But yeah, like lack of ambiguity, I think, is the number one thing. For me also, there was a beauty in the simplicity of, hey, everything's controlled by a panel or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like that was a cool thing to do. But the core reason was to keep people from clicking all over the screen, right?
And it does seem good if you have an intermediating thing like a panel where you can just say, look, you can do anything else you want with a panel, right? Like I can make it turn things on and off, and I can make it rotate things, and I can do all sorts of stuff. So it's not limiting, right? It's just, it adds clarity to what's going on. But I was just curious because that's another sort of adjunct to the aesthetic question, I guess, at that point.
Yeah, and even with the witness, actually, that was not obvious in the beginning. Like I had buttons for the first couple years of development. You probably
oh really? I don't remember that for some reason.
Yeah, there were buttons that you would push to like open doors and stuff.
Okay.
But thankfully, I realized I could take them out because it made the game a lot better.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess I have one final question then, and then we could ask chat if there's anything in particular. Um, so the final question is about variation in the aesthetics to begin with. And that is to say that in the Sokoban game in particular is a good example of this. At some point, you have to ask yourself, how much aesthetics, when the aesthetics start piling onto something, right? So you can take a Sokoban level, and you can imagine looking at the Sokoban level the way that you do when you are first prototyping stuff, and the art isn't done yet, and it's just a bunch of cubes and people moving around. That's like the most gameplay clear possible thing to look at, because you can literally see exactly like where the squares are, and you know exactly what everything is. There's literally no additional, your brain doesn't have to do any translation between 5 different types of plants and the concept that actually they're all the same thing, because there's no difference between those 2 plants even though they look different, right?
Yeah.
So my question is there anything in particular that you think about, or is it just a like gotta go by feel kind of thing? But is there anything concrete that you think about when you think about building out the aesthetics of a game, about how not to go too far with the aesthetics? Because at some point, even if you are being consistent, you could imagine just if you pack enough variation onto the screen, it just becomes harder for the player to know what is what, just period, right? Like,
Yeah.
separate from anything else, the most clear thing is that if every entity type has exactly one on-screen representation, is by far the clearest thing you can show somebody. And so you're always getting a little less clear every time you add a non-meaningful variation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
At least 2 things to say about this. One of them is it is very valuable to have some of these, both to start the game by just having these, designer or programmer art levels, right, that are just straight up gridded with no decoration. And in fact, for the Sokoban game, because we haven't entered like full production, we have most levels are that way, right? So the nice thing about that is you can compare and contrast at any time about, oh, here's a thing that's clear and unambiguous, and then how about this thing over here, right? How does it feel relative? Which you wouldn't have if you somehow built a game by like starting to do all the art from square one and all that, which I think experienced game developers don't do that now, but I think inexperienced teams kind of still do. Yeah, and maybe. Actually, in the old days, even experienced teams used to do that because schedules were just like short. And by the time you had a game, you remember how hard it used to be even to get a game running, right? Like by the time you had a game running, it was like 2 months to ship or something.
Yeah. I remember like at Looking Glass, that would happen a lot because there was so much work to do. They would have 2 or 3 months total to like look at things at the end. It was hardly any time at all.
Yeah. So this is a great advantage that we have today, is that we know that we can do this. I mean, I guess it's a downside of having long development cycles, but you might as well use that, right?
So that's a good point. So basically, sort of what you're saying there is like, look, you probably built some scaffolding because your game development process probably demanded it or should have. So if you can just keep the ability to look at those 2 things, and so that you don't really have to guess. You can just say, how much more confusing does this get when I switch to the actual art? And if I start to feel like it's getting a little bit out of hand, then I need to start pulling back on those reins.
Yes. Okay. And so then there's a second part of that, which is you have to actually be able to accurately perceive for each of those levels how clear or unclear is it. And this is where I don't know what to say about this, right? Because this is something that has come natural to me for a long time, maybe at least since Braid, but I don't that much hear other designers talk about it.
Okay.
Or not in public or not at GDC. I don't know. But like a lot of my job is to be grumpy about what the art team makes and tell them to change it to be more clear, right?
Right.
In one way or another. And one of the ways that I do that is I just so we'll get a new visual mock-up of a level. It'll be like, at this stage, we're not just doing visual mock-ups of a particular level, but it's like, okay, this level is an example of a certain visual theme for which there are a number of different meshes and stuff all in the same theme, and we can use them flexibly to build a bunch of levels, right? So we're figuring out the theme. And really what I do is I look at the screen and I see where my attention goes. I see if it's being dragged away from what's important to play, or if it's being dragged toward what's important to play. It's like the same kind, I'm not a photographer, right? But I imagine it's the same kind of thing a photographer does when they're judging composition of a photograph that they're going to take.
Right.
Right.
Got it.
It's like, how salient is this scene? How coherent is it? This is a puzzle game. Is what is on the screen letting me solve the puzzle, or is it bugging me all the time? Right?
Yep.
Do I have to like stare past something and squint in order to solve the puzzle? Right? And a lot of games seem to be very bad at having made these decisions. But for me, it's very important, and I just sit there and feel what it feels like to look at the screen. Now, a lot of
modern games don't really like AAA games just punted this entirely. They just you have to push a button to get it to even draw the things that you solve the puzzle on, right?
Well, I mean, a lot of puzzle games are not good, but actually some big budget games are pretty good at this these days, right? Like
really? Like what?
Like the last couple Call of Duty games, for example.
Okay.
They don't have the same kind of aesthetic, but like they do a good job of being readable, let's say, right?
I see, because I'm thinking more like Cyberpunk or Red Dead Redemption or those games. Like
you just play those.
Or The Witcher. You have to turn on a visor to even see the gameplay elements. The gameplay elements aren't even shown, so you don't even know what they are in the normal aesthetics of the game. So they just punt it, and they're just like, it's an overlay. Right?
I don't know. Or like another example that comes to mind is Valorant, which there's some things that are very unappealing to me about that game, so I've never played it. But like, if you look at the level design and the art style, you can tell that readability was one of the highest priorities.
Okay, cool.
So like the walls are all kind of like pastel and washed out and not having a lot of like high frequency details and stuff.
I see.
So that you can see people's silhouette against a wall very quickly and react.
I see.
That's for different reasons, of course, because it's a shooter, but they're actually similar reasons.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, this is a place where, I believe that there's a skill dimension here that I lucked into in some way, because I don't think I was as good at noticing what my brain was doing. Like back when I don't know, when I was in college aspiring to do video games at some point, right? Like somehow I learned how to pay, because you have to pay attention to how you're reacting to the level and have that be accurate, and also noticing things that are subtle.
Right. Yeah, it's like being a sports coach. Like you have to be able to see like how you were doing the thing with the ball or whatever, or the bat. You can't just do it and be good at, like, you need to, in order to be able to actually communicate it or be thorough about it, you need to start like sensing what you were actually doing at like a once removed level or something.
Yeah. And sometimes I find this hard to explain to other team members exactly what's wrong, and it takes a few iterations, but the most important thing is spotting what's wrong, right?
Yes.
And then you can iterate till you nail it down. And then eventually, human beings are good, even if you can't explain something that well linguistically, human beings are good at extrapolating from examples usually. So once you establish a few examples of what's good, people will kind of get it and be like, okay, this is the kind of thing that we're making.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the questions I had. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I should be asking at this point, because, maybe there is, and I'll think of it later and then be like, oops. But I think that was basically everything Um, yeah. Do we want to check to see if chat has anything to say?
Hello, chat. Do you have on-topic questions? At them at me so that I know what is intended to be a question to us. And it could be for me, it could be for Casey, it could be for both of us, but on topic only, about this aspect of game design.
So Technic Beam is saying something here that I also had a question of. I assumed you already got to it, but maybe you didn't, so I'll say it again. When I mentioned the secret game that no one can know about,
Yeah.
you said something that you said because I was saying, oh, certain things that maybe seem like they're actually just in the background suddenly become relevant when characters gain new skills or something.
Yeah. I
And
assume
you
you
said
mean
something
like
about
trees.
delayed. What?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what I meant at that point, but if I know what you're talking about, I assume you mean like trees and bushes, for example.
Correct. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I didn't know. You did say something at that point where you're like, we'll get to that later. And I don't know if you actually did get to it.
I think I meant something else. I'm pretty sure we got to whatever we were going to
good.
say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
We can't say exactly what game that is because that comes later.
Yes. Just wanted to make sure you actually did get to say whatever it was.
Yes. Someone saying, is the goal of having a realistic art style a bad idea because it goes directly against this differentiation goal? In general, something that is very realistic is probably not going to be very playable. Even games that are supposedly realistic, the successful ones, if you look at the way they're designed, there are a lot of things that are unrealistic about the art style. So like realistic art style doesn't exactly mean trying to look like the real world right now. And I doubt that it will for a long time. Because you do, one of the very old game design things that you would have heard at GDC back in the 90s and 2000s that actually was correct was that you want the game should communicate the affordances to the player, right? Which is just if there are things that you can do, you probably should know pretty clearly that you can do those things, unless it's part of the point of the game to hide the fact that you could do those things, right? Will this stream be available? Yeah, we're going to put it on YouTube. How do you differentiate between what you were calling an overlay and your example of full color against sepia? Well, I assume what Casey is saying is like what a lot of games do. Like there could be like a HUD reticle that pops up, like Watch Dogs or something, right? Is like you get close to somebody and it's like, you can hack this person.
Yes.
And it puts a HUD icon on them, or Assassin's Creed or something.
Well, I've just noticed it was probably just me being unlucky or something, but it was like an epidemic. Like I played, probably shouldn't use that term these days. It was like a bad penny. It kept turning up. And I played like 7 games in a row. Like I played like 7 AAA games, just randomly. They were just games I bought on the PS4 to play one time. And I went through them, and it was like Far Cry 4 or 5 or something. And what was the Days Gone and Metal Gear Solid Phantom Pain. And like it was just like this whole string of games. And every single one, you always switch into like some kind of additional mode to know what the heck is going on. So it's like, hold down this key to like let you sight enemies and see like traps or whatever. And then they show them in like this little overlaid thing. It's basically just admitting up front that like the actual way the game is presented is not a particularly good way to play it, right?
Yeah.
And it was just so many in a row that it was very shocking to me. I was like, is this just how all of them are now? Because I don't play that many AAA games these days. It was just weird. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely not all of them, but I know like that's the games where they kind of phoned it in, right? That aspect of the game for sure.
Yeah. What's going on here? There's lots of other J underscore blows.
I don't know. I'm seeing questions
Nothing,
that
nothing useful.
I don't. If you see one that you feel super motivated to talk about, like
Well,
we're
I
getting a
don't
lot of
know.
like general questions, like very general. And or moderately off-topic questions.
I would say that, like, so I have only one comment for looking at the questions, which is there's one question that is, I am currently working on a game and weighing diegetic versus non-diegetic UI. What do you think the trade-offs for this choice are? And my first thought is, I don't even think I know exactly what the term diegetic even means.
No, I have
Like,
no idea what that means in this
I assume it
context.
means, like, is the UI integrated into the world versus is it like a word that pops up like open,
Yeah,
right?
I don't know.
Is
That's
that what
probably
you mean
someone who
by
went to game design school.
right? Yeah, I know that they like to fetishize word descriptors in those game design schools, but is that what diegetic means in this context?
I honestly have no idea. I would
Well,
guess that.
I'm asking the chat. I'm asking the person who
Yeah.
asked the question. Is that what diegetic it means? In universe, okay. So yeah, they do mean that. That's an okay question for aesthetics, though. Once you translate it out of game school speak, uh, so the question of like, do you pop up explicit UI or don't you pop up explicit UI? And I suppose, if I had to guess based on all the stuff that you just said, if I had to sort of imagine the answer, we'll see if I've learned something here. Then the answer probably is that question is not really a question that you would ever ask in isolation, because whether or not you want to make the UI be something that looks a little removed from the world, or whether you want the UI to look more sort of integrated into the world, is presumably just one of the aesthetic knobs you can turn. So much like you said, where you're like, okay, we can have a particle effect on this thing or not. We can have it be flowery, like the cactus. It can be moving differently. And then yet another thing is we can decorate it with things that are intentionally like fiction breaking. And presumably what you would do when you looked at a trade-off like that is go, it's just one of those things in the palette, so there's nothing special about it just because the word diegetic exists. It's just another one of those knobs I can turn. And so my answer as to whether I turn that knob is A, does it improve the feel when I'm looking at this screen? Because you could imagine like a sci-fi game might really be benefited from having these weird like pop-up kind of, text things on it, whereas like a fantasy game, it might feel a little bit like it makes it look kind of worse or whatever.
Yeah.
And then it's how badly did you need it? If you've backed yourself into the corner and you really can't figure out a good way to differentiate something in the world, and you just have to do it, then it's a knob you had to turn. But so I don't know. How'd I do?
That sounds totally sensible to me. I have nothing to add there.
Okay. All right.
There's a question I saw here. Is detective mode inherently bad or just a worthwhile sacrifice to make for having a certain realistic visual style? What I would say is it's probably inherently bad most of the time. All other, like there are good ways to use it, but all else being equal, it's just a way of phoning in part of your game design. It's like a way of spackling over holes in the wall of your game design and then like not painting over the spackle or whatever. Like the way, like, is the detective mode actual gameplay or is it just telling you what the active things are, right? Like, an example of it being actual gameplay is maybe when you're in detective mode, you can't see actually certain kinds of things. And then you could, have a problem because you didn't see things and then they came up on you really fast or whatever. Or do you only get a certain number of opportunities to use detective mode? And if you don't use it at certain times, then, you're maybe going to miss something. And so you would do better or worse based on your choice of when to use it. Like those kind of things start to make it an actual design element, right? Absent that, like one or two games where you had detective mode would be cool. It's like, oh, neat. I can push this button and it changes the shader that we draw the screen. And then I see these other things. But like when frickin' every game does it, it's just boring. You know, it's just like, it's yet another, like the problem with AAA games, certain categories of them at least, is that they're accreting an ever larger number of boilerplate conventions.
Yes.
That are what it
Yes.
is to be one of these games.
Yes.
And then every time you play one, you're just playing all these conventions. And then maybe there's a tiny bit of something new in there to try and make it worthwhile.
It's so weird because you open up one of these games, like any of the ones I just said, and it's like it's literally just looks like they all downloaded the same like recipe off of Food Network for making the casserole or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just like, okay, like why is there this crafting in here? It doesn't do anything. It's just like, you know that I'm just gonna have this many of all these things, and I'm gonna push this button to make the like arrow that I need for my bow or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just like every single game has it. And the same with detective mode, and like the same with hiding in the tall grass while the guard walks by. It's like, it's all the same.
Yeah.
Right? You can move the body. Like every game is, you can pick up the body and move the body now. Now it doesn't matter because it like randomly will find the body later no matter where you put it.
Yep.
But like, it's so weird. Like they had to put them on there and just like, you're playing the game and you're just like, why are these things in here? It just doesn't make any sense.
By
But,
the
like,
way, you
that's
could
the
also
recipe
do
for
that
casserole.
you could also move the body in Thief from 1995 or whatever year that
Yes.
was.
Yes.
Probably earlier.
So I was going to say one thing about detective mode, which is it strikes me as sort of like the good example of detective mode, to analogize it, is like the 4x scope. So like you wouldn't just play the entire game with or without the 4x scope. Like you want to scope when it's advantageous to shoot like far away, and you don't look through the scope when you're trying to like shoot someone in the room right next to you. And if detective mode was like that, like I want to be playing in detective mode when I'm doing something specific, but when I'm doing the same activity but under a slightly different condition, I wouldn't use it. Then it would become an actual tool. As it is, it's just we made this area be a detective mode area. So you just know when you go into it, you'll use it. It's not interesting, right?
And the irony of detective mode often is actually it's sort of the opposite of what it claims to be, in the sense that you could play this game and be a detective and look carefully around the environment for clues. But what happens is you push the button and it makes you not have to be a detective, and it points at where the things are, right? So
yes, 100%.
Rip that game design right there. I don't know. It's such a lost opportunity.
I agree. Yes. And I always would prefer to play the game where I actually did the detecting. Like I would way rather you walked into a room and just had to look at everything and figure out what happened. Like that's just such a much better game to me. But
that is a much harder design problem.
Oh, certainly. Yeah.
That's why the game designers get paid, is to solve the design problems, right?
Well, it's also a Conway's Law problem. So I kind of feel like AAA games have this for a certain separation of concerns issue. So if you look at it not as the game designers just didn't know what they were doing, and rather you look at it as the game designers can only design game things and the art department makes the art, and the talking between the two on giant teams is really hard and low bandwidth, then it's like the reason we have detective mode is because the game designers can make the game in detective mode without talking to the art team very much. And then the art team can make the rooms with all the stuff in them without talking to the game designers very much. And so you end up with your game looking like your org chart, which is what Conway's Law says will happen, right?
Yeah.
So.
Let's see. Okay, someone is saying if you're introducing a new gameplay element, you should probably make it clear for a player. What I often see in games is flashy click here effects, and it feels a bit mean. I don't know what he means by mean, but on the other hand, you want the player not to miss it. So how do you balance this exactly? That's just, again, like, is your scene readable? Like, if something is new and your scene is readable, the new thing will capture a lot of attention, right? In the design, let's say if it was a puzzle game, again, the lighting on the square where the thing starts in the puzzle game would highlight its existence on the level as well as the design of the mesh of the thing being very readable and attention getting. You would, the background colors of whatever the background is on that level would not share much. Well, either they wouldn't share much palette with it so that it stands out, so that it contrasts, or they would share a lot of palette with it to theme it. It sort of depends on like what you're trying to do. And like you have choices there, but you can just be very deliberate about what you're doing, and it comes across very clearly. Like if I see a game that goes like, this is the 3 snowball snowman, and he will throw 2 snowballs per round at you. Click here to see that happen. Like that to me is a sign of a really bad game that I don't want to play. AKA an iOS game. Yeah. It's just doing the job that Casey and I were talking about well.
So one thing someone was asking, like, about me saying that a lot of recent AAA games have a separate button to view what's going on. In a sense, it's a bad design, but what's the criteria for well-designed game except personal experience? Lots of them sell well and quite fun.
Okay, right now, can we just stop forever people complaining that you can't comment on something because it sells well? Like forever? Can we just like put that? Can I just have that as a permanent overlay on the bottom of the Twitch channel? Like, don't ever, because that's completely irrelevant. I don't know. I'm not even going to get into a rant of.
Well, I can skip the rant part and I can just point out what I would say about that is that when you're selling something like a AAA game, there's a lot more there than just the game design, right? So a lot of what you're buying when you buy a AAA game is the AV. And, the easiest way to see something like that is, if you look at something like Cyberpunk 2077, almost universally panned, sold very well, because, it's a Cyberpunk game. Like, I bought a copy. It's like, people are buying into the fact that we haven't had a high production value Cyberpunk game where you could go and, be in a city and walk around, and right? People aren't buying the game design. It's not just a game design in a box. Some indie games are that because they don't have the resources or don't want to make a huge production out of it. But when you're talking about high budget commercial titles, the game design is like a very tiny piece of that, especially for these things like RPGs, where a lot of what you're doing is playing through sort of a long drawn out movie that sort of has some shooting interspersed in it, right? And so you can still look at the design of those games and go, wow, we could be doing the design of these games a lot better, without suggesting that somehow people aren't buying them or that they shouldn't buy them, because they're not just buying a game design. I'm pretty sure that if you took the game design from some of these AAA games and you stripped away all the AV and you just turned it into like an ASCII art thing, no one would play it. They'd all play Rogue or something instead. So I think it's kind of incontrovertible that the game design in these games is not very good, because I don't see what anyone would point to as the thing you're actually doing that's any fun. But that doesn't mean they're not a good product, and it doesn't mean that people aren't even or that they're not even getting their money's worth. They're buying something. It just isn't necessarily a game design that's great.
Yeah, right? That's all true, but it's even more vacuous than that. So if you imagine a world where the game design was one of the major reasons why people buy things, right?
Yeah.
But also game design is very difficult and hard to get right and hard to advance our thinking about. even if people are buying for game design, they're going to buy the best things that they have available.
Right.
Right. So
Yes.
if you're the person who comes along and wants to drive game design forward and you say, no, these designs are bad because of X, Y, and Z, the argument that things that do X, Y, and Z a different way sell very well is still nonsensical. Like there is almost no scheme in which it is actually a substantially meaningful objection, except that to say that, well, doing game design the way that it's being done is obviously not so bad that it kills the project, right?
Which is important because when you are making a AAA game, obviously none of us would disagree that you do need some safety because no one's going to pay, $500 million to develop a game only to find out that the game is something no one will play for some reason, right?
Yes.
So picking, no matter how stupid the game design might be, if you know that someone already shipped a game that was just an AV festival with that game design, at least it's not going to kill you, right? It's not going to sink the project, and that's worth a lot because plenty of game designs could, right?
Yes, that is true.
Yes.
That is true. Well, I don't know. We'll give people another minute or two. Let's get some more serious questions in here.
All right.
And we'll see. We might be done. I don't know. This was
It
a
wasn't
much
that
shorter.
broad of a topic. It was a pretty narrowly focused thing, and I think we got a lot of the juice out of it there.
Yeah.
So hopefully, unless I failed to ask a critical question.
People are asking off-topic programming questions. This is not what we are doing right now. We're doing questions about the specific topic in game design that we have been discussing for an hour. And if you would like to know more about that, you can ask.
So that's a real question. Is there anything besides color and animation that you often leverage for readability?
Yeah, I mentioned before, actually.
Particles was one.
Well,
right?
particles is kind of animation, I guess.
That's true.
There's how. So I said high frequency details before as an example, which is an easy example for me because it's something we thought about a lot on The Witness and avoided. But in general, like the kind of detail on your surface, right? Do you have kind of big flat textures? Do you have textures with lots of, this is sort of color in a sense, but it's also not, right? You could have textures that are, blue and yellow, and one of them is very mellow, and another one is high frequency and sharp, right? And so there's a little bit of an orthogonal direction from strictly color. What else, though? What was color and animation? General shape of the thing, right? So the thing that Valve did way back in the couple of times that they did relatively forward-thinking game design things. Do you remember when they did the whole introduction of the Team Fortress characters? This was a GDC thing.
Right.
They were talking about how they, way before they ruined the game with all the hats and stuff, right? They were talking about how they very carefully designed all the characters for silhouette recognition, which I think was just something they picked up from Pixar or whatever, right? But applied it appropriately to game design, and it worked well, and it made a lot of sense, right? So your visual system has several parts, right? There's a silhouette recognition part, there's a color recognition part, and there's like a line recognition part, and there's probably other stuff, right? Like texture and things that are more subtle. But those three things are sort of some of the major components that people play with frequently. Although again, those are all, you could categorize all of those as color or animation, I guess. Lighting, again, which is really, if we're talking about things that you see, right, it's still sort of color, but like lighting can really help in terms of whether things are picked out or not. Both the intensity of the lighting and the color of the lighting can matter a lot. Framing in a scene, right? Like if there are inert parts of the scene, for example, do they arrange and draw attention to particular things, or do they detract from it, right?
I suppose response would be another one too. Like if when the player does something, if an animation was related to that or not related to that would be sort of a little bit different from animation. Because animation suggests that the thing is just doing things, right? But if specifically certain things happen, and any of these things could be driven by that, if certain things happen when the player moves or other things like that, that would be a pretty strong cue, probably.
Yeah, for sure.
Sound, I suppose, is another one.
Yep. Although usually, often sounds are tied to, like one rule that I use for explaining this is just saying that you should definitely tie sounds to important state changes in meaningful state variables of the game, right?
I see.
Which doesn't mean don't have sounds for other things. In fact, it sort of means you want to ramp into that. So like some entity that can make lots of sounds because it changes game state, prior to it changing game state, maybe that means it justifies having an ambient sound, right? Mm-hmm. When you get close to it or something, right?
Yeah.
Whereas other things don't, or not as distinctive ambient sounds or something like that. Really, anything you can think of is good, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make a coherent composition of what, like you have when the player is playing your game, you have their attention, right? And are you using it well, or are you like wasting their attention in some sense? And anything you can do to not waste their attention is good. When considering readability, do you think about colorblind people? How do you approach it? I mean, you're fortunately aided in this fact by a lot of these things that we've discussed are roughly the same for people who have various color blindness as they are for not. It's just a little bit different, right? You have less ability for people who have deuteranopia, for example. They're not going to be able to distinguish certain colors very well. But the problem you have is you don't really know as a designer which colors, because it actually depends a lot like on their display, and then people are, their eyes are a little bit different from instance to instance. So the best you can do is plan. So you can do like the iOS puzzle games do or whatever, and instead of differentiating your bubbles that you have to pop just by color, you can put patterns on them and stuff, and that goes a long way. But you want to be careful not to I don't know. There's a way of overdoing that where it's just super cheesy. But it's actually, you have the opposite problem too. You can have, it's very rare, but you can have people who are tetrachromats, which means they see 4 color channels. And good luck with that, because what they see totally probably depends on the monitor they're using and whatever. Like, at some point, like
there are people who have an extra color receptor.
Yes, it's usually women.
What?
For some reason, it's usually women. Like, it's very rare, but of people who have it, most of them are women.
What colors what is there a particular bandwidth, or is it random?
It's a particular one. I don't remember.
Wow.
What it is.
All right.
Yeah, try designing for that, right?
Yeah. That must be hellish to use computers. Those people probably hate using computers.
Maybe. You know what? I would bet that. No, I wouldn't bet anything, actually.
Because all the images will look wrong. Like, you look at a tree and it won't look like a tree, even though it looks like a tree to everyone else, because the colors will be wrong.
Yeah. So someone we both know who is colorblind, I was talking to him a long time ago, and it actually took him a long time to realize he was colorblind. Just because I don't like things seemed a little weird. Like the way people described things seemed a little weird and off sometimes, but like that's true for everything, right?
But color blindness means that computer displays will still look the same as things in the real world.
I guess.
If you get a new color channel, it means that when you look at a computer image, it doesn't look like the thing you took a photograph of because one of the channels is missing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that
I don't
must
know.
be so freaky.
But yeah.
Like imagine taking a picture. I don't know why we're talking about this now, but imagine taking a picture with your phone. So you just hold it up, you take the picture, you're looking right at the thing, you look at the phone, and it's just a completely different color. That's what would happen.
I guess so. But like computers are pretty broken anyway. Would that be any different
I guess you're right.
I don't know. I cannot speak to that experience.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about clarity as it affects difficulty? For example, in a game with a grenade that can be thrown, the most clear thing would be to show an arc on the screen to tell the player where it would land. But on the other hand, showing the player where the grenade lands trivializes the skill of throwing it. Yeah, I mean, like I probably wouldn't do that. I probably wouldn't do the draw the arc in the air thing. You could be like PUBG and draw the arc of where the grenade's going to go, but it's actually wrong because the code is wrong and the grenade goes somewhere else. And so you can only use it as a general guideline, or you have to develop the skill of learning where it's actually going to go relative to where it says it's going to go. No, I don't know. That's just a thing. That's a design problem where you would think about what that means for your particular game and how you want to answer that question.
Oh, it's so someone was saying, oh, it's Hamish. He was saying it's yellow. Yeah. Yeah, I know it's not a new color. I'm just saying it's if you can actually see yellow, and then you take a photograph, it will reproduce as red and green. So when you look at it, you will see that it's actually red and green now, not yellow, right? A person who could actually see yellow, whereas the thing they were looking at actually looked actually yellow to them, right? So it is very similar to someone was making the analogy to a black and white photo. It would be very much like that. Like if you were a tetrachromad, I would imagine that looking at a computer is much like looking at like a black and white television set in a way, in that you have to imagine that the color yellow is there, even though it's not, which must just be really weird. I had no idea. Thank you for telling me that, John. I had no idea. I'm very fascinated now.
I'm sure it's not actually that simple, right? Because I mean, already, right? Already what you see as yellow in real life is not what your monitor does to produce yellow, right? Like your monitor to produce yellow stimulates red and green. And in real life, you could see pigments. Some pigments could be stimulating red and green, or some could actually be reflecting the wavelength of yellow, right?
Right, but your eye response would be the same.
Yes, but I just haven't thought enough. Okay, this is not the topic of the thing.
Well, I think about color response curves a lot for whatever reason. So to me, I'm just saying I had no idea, because I've always wondered, because there are animals with like 5 color receptors. And I've always wondered if when they look at like a picture, if they're like, this is crap, right? And I didn't know there were humans we could actually ask, right? And say, what does it look at? So now I want to go read. I'll stop talking about that, but that was very fascinating.
It's not that rare. Like the number that I vaguely remember is like 4% of the population. So it's not like some freakish, like 1 in 50,000 people or something. It's like,
I'm totally going to go read. I'm sure there's like some stuff online where people describe it, right? So I'll read that. Very interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
Are there times in game design where you'd want to punish inattentive players by not highlighting the difference in elements? Sure. but you better make sure you're doing that on purpose, right? The problem is most designers do it by accident. That's the difference. If you do it on purpose and it's good, then it's good. Do you like a game design more if it has good visual design?
Like everyone does, really.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, like people see, there was this idea in indie games way back, and I think it was based on wishful thinking, but like people had this idea that there was the design part of the game and then like the production value part of the game, and then an indie game could be really good if it just did design and didn't do production value. And it's like that's not completely untrue, right? You can definitely, like, there's lots of these puzzle script games, you play them, they have really good design, they have not much production value, but they legitimately, A, would be more enjoyable if they actually had more production value, but B, they'd be more playable, they would be more understandable, and more, they would be less confusing for bad reasons sometimes, right? Like the way, like if it's a puzzle game, for example, it's good if people are thinking about the puzzle and not thinking about what they're being confused by that you didn't intend them to be confused by, right? And the clearer and the crisper the game's communication is, and the more responsive it is to their actions, and you know, the more unambiguous it is about what matters and what doesn't matter, like we've been discussing. All these things feed into that, right? And it's a better game when you do that well. Now, high production values take budget, right? And not everyone can do that. So I'm not saying people are bad for not doing that. I'm just saying it legit does make the game better if done well. Doesn't always mean that it's always the most, like, if you have a choice of making the design better or making the production better, make the design better, right? But there's a difference. That's all I'm saying. Old adventure point and clicks were ambiguous about interactability on purpose all the time. Was that bad design? I don't know what games you mean. I probably didn't play a lot of those, but almost certainly yes.
I played a lot of them, and almost certainly yes.
So there's one game, the one game that comes to mind of the point and click era that I played way after it came out was Loom by Brian Moriarty, right? And I like Brian's games a lot. I really respect him as a designer, but Loom has what I think is a very blatant mistake in it. And it derailed me from being able to progress from the beginning of the game for a long time. And at least in the version that I played, which was apparently the re-release with like touched up graphics, but it probably was this way in the original way too. There's like some tent that you go into. Like you need to go to some hall of whatever, and there's some tent you go into,
Yep.
and it looks black
exactly
on the right-hand side of the screen. And you're like, there's nothing over there.
Yep.
And it's really slow to walk, so you're not going to, right?
Just keep walking and
you have to walk, right?
Yep.
And that was like an hour for me. I might have even
I had the exact same thing happen to me when I was freaking 7 or whenever I played that game.
And it's so absurd because your character lives in this village. Your character knows where the damn hall is, right?
And can see from where he's standing.
Yes.
He can see it.
Yes. So that's the worst mistake in that game. And it seems to me like it was actually a design decision. Like that doesn't seem like a random art thing. Like that seems like, oh yeah, we'll have it be hidden. You have to, but you know, back in the late 80s, early 90s, we hadn't really matured as designers yet. And we did lots of stupid stuff. So,
and to be fair to Loom, it avoids the vast majority of problems that other games had at the time by sort of localizing all of the puzzle solving to the staff. So
yes,
you happen to be picking on that one just because it was one of the only ones you played, but it was actually way better designed.
Yes,
than
Loom
almost
was
anything else you could buy.
It was a very forward-thinking, very groundbreaking
Very
game
forward-thinking. Very forward-thinking. Yeah.
It was probably the first really systemic puzzle adventure game, right? Probably.
Oh gosh, I don't know. That's a interesting thought problem.
Like you sort of had like the Enchanter series from Infocom, where you sort of had spells that did stuff, but like it's
But
really
they didn't
implemented as
really,
if
yeah,
statements, and they
yeah,
didn't
yeah,
always
yeah.
do what you expected and stuff.
Yep.
So I feel like Loom was clearly more systemic than that.
I feel like you might be right. I'd have to think about that, but that seems very likely. Yeah, and
Yeah.
then it was never really followed up, unfortunately, because you could see how if you made another game like that, you could have pushed further along the same exact axis.
Yeah.
But
My impression is it actually didn't sell that well. Like
no,
I
I'm sure it didn't. I'm sure it didn't because the other things they were selling were pedigree at that point. They had
yeah.
like Indiana Jones and the Monkey Island series was like
Yeah.
established already,
Yeah.
I think. So Loom just
Yeah.
didn't catch on, I don't think.
Yeah, I am not the digital antiquarian, but I feel like Loom actually also got a not that great critical reception initially and only became respected later. Um, but I'm not sure.
Well, because again, it was sort of designed to be relatively easy, intentionally so, if I
Yeah.
remember correctly.
Oh yeah. So if you're one of these guys who's like, I want the ego of a hard puzzle game, and that's what,
Exactly.
and yeah,
And yeah, uh-huh.
yeah,
Yeah. And so if they'd had a hard mode Loom, they did, ironically, but all it was just pitch training. Like, it didn't make the puzzles any harder, right? It was just that you didn't get to see the notes flash on your staff when you heard the song. That was the hard mode. And so I think, like, most reviewers probably found it too easy because, I'm imagining you probably walked straight on through it, except for the fact that you couldn't see the side of the hall there. But so I think most players just thought it was too simplistic, right? And I can understand where they're coming from there too, because the forward thinkingness of it, you can't appreciate that these design ideas were good until you actually see, you've never seen The Witness or something, right? You don't know where systemic game design is going, right? So what are you gonna do?
yeah. We have an elaboration on the question. The elaboration is re-asking, do you think that a gameplay mechanic is better if it has a better visual story, which I don't know what that means, but is a gun in a game a good mechanic because there are real guns which do similar things? Do you try to find such mechanics, or do you try to come up with the visual story only? I don't know what this person means by
Maybe
story.
they mean an analogy,
Um,
like an analog.
Like the word story just gives me hives, I have to say, because you have all these people who, it's actually not as bad as it used to be. But some people are just kind of story fetishists, and they think that everything should be story and that all the values in games is story, which I disagree with. It's not as bad as when you had all these video game schools teaching that video games are story. But you still have some of that. But like, yeah, the word story. Oh, and the reason it bothers me is because it leads to people taking all these cues from other media, like, film and like bad film, like Marvel movies and whatever, and Star Wars novelizations and stuff, which is not necessarily that bad, but like that's a small percentage of what you should be paying attention. You should mostly be paying attention to other video games because they have the most overlap with what you're trying to do. So,
I think in that particular question, though, the use of the word story is just analog, right? Is what they meant. Like they just mean
like, is it connected to other ideas somehow visually?
like I think I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of the person asking the question. Is how important do you think it is to have the visuals of the game be like related to related to something real that the person already knows, that serves a similar sorry, not game design, but that serves a similar purpose in the real world as to one in the game design, right? So, how important is it that something that can shoot looks like a gun, or that something that can write looks like a pencil, or something like that? Or is it valuable to do that, or is that really not that big of a concern because games are abstract? Is that what the person was asking?
Maybe. I mean, if that's the question, I would say that's a tool that you can use, right? I mean, this is actually how they wrecked the iPhone initially, right? Was the iPhone had the so-called skeuomorphic design originally.
Yes.
And then the snooty designers came along who decided skeuomorphism is bad because this is the future and everything
yes.
should be a featureless gray cube. So they made
Yes.
everything on the iPhone a featureless gray cube, and it became completely unusable because you didn't have those associations, right?
Yes.
So that is definitely a tool you can use. It is something where if you don't use it, you now need to solve those communication problems another way, right? They may be easy to solve, they may be hard to solve, but it is very context dependent, I think. The dude keeps talking about guns. I don't want to talk about guns. Anyway, he says you got it. So
Okay.
that's
Okay.
good.
Yeah.
Do you think it's generally better to assume the person playing your game might never have played a video game before, or does it make sense to try and build upon their presumed prior game knowledge? I mean, here's the thing. I don't think you should make a game deliberately inaccessible unless it's about being inaccessible, right? But to take books as an analogy, the great novels do not start out with see spot run, run spot run, and then build their way up to, all happy families are the same, right? That's not how it goes.
Unless you're James Joyce.
Well, he's doing something totally different, I guess. But so I think if you start with see spot run, you're kind of limiting where you're going to go, or you're fooling yourself. Like if you're trying to do something really interesting by the end of the game, and you think people need see spot run in the beginning, the people who needed to see spot run are not going to get to the end probably.
Yeah.
Like you just have to decide what you're doing. Right. I mean, imagine how bad books would be if every single one, right? Okay. Like I have a book over there about differential forms, right? Okay. So I pick up this math book, and first it's like see spot run.
Yeah.
And then it's like, here are numbers. And then here's the plus sign. And then
Well, what it would be. You know what it would be, actually. Like, it would just be Twitter. Like, if you want to know what it looks like, if you were to take a great book and say, we're going to always start with no knowledge, you get Twitter. You just get everyone saying things that are the most obvious thing forever, and you never can get to the actual meaningful thing because no one can ever progress. Like, it's just too many people not on the right page.
I wasn't sure where you were going with that initially, but I completely get it now. Yes.
Like these categorizations.
All right. I think we're
topic.
done.
Yep.
Let's be done. Thank you, everybody, for coming by.
Thank you, John, for answering all of my weird questions.
Yes. And it went pretty fast this time. It wasn't even 5 hours, so that's great.
Perfect.
Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you later. I'm just going to sign off.
Have a good one.
Bye.